"You're wasting good lumber," the old man called from across the gravel road, shaking his head with a grin. "Nobody builds a shed around a house unless they've lost their mind." Jonah Price paused, with a heavy cedar beam balanced across his shoulder, and looked toward the voice without the slightest hint of irritation. At 68, the retired Army veteran had long ago learned that silence often carried more strength than arguments ever could. He simply adjusted his grip, nodded once, and kept walking. Beside him, Ace, a large German shepherd with a rich black and tan coat, watched the exchange carefully, before following his owner toward the weathered cabin, sitting alone on the ridge above Black Creek, Montana. The cabin had belonged to Jonah's uncle decades earlier, but years of snow, wind, and neglect had stripped away nearly everything except the thick timber walls and stubborn foundation. Most people saw a forgotten shack ready to collapse. Jonah saw something different. He walked slowly around the structure, studying every angle as if reading an old map that only he could understand. Instead of repairing the cabin itself, he drove fresh cedar posts into the frozen ground, several feet away from every wall, marking a second outline that completely surrounded the original building. By noon, passing pickup trucks had begun slowing down along the county road. Drivers stared at the strange framework rising around the cabin before continuing toward town, carrying another story with them. Before sunset, nearly everyone in Black Creek had heard about the quiet veteran building what looked like a giant wooden cage around his own house. At the diner, the conversations came easily. Some believed he was trying to keep wildlife away. Others joked he expected an invasion. One rancher laughed loud enough for half the room to hear. Next, he'll build a roof over the roof. The laughter spread quickly. Jonah never heard any of it. He remained on the ridge, measuring every board with careful precision before fastening each beam into place. Every nail landed with calm, deliberate rhythm. Nothing about his movements appeared rushed. Ace wandered slowly around the property, occasionally stopping to sniff the cold wind drifting down from the mountains, before returning to Jonah's side without being called. As the afternoon faded into evening, dark clouds gathered beyond the northern peaks. Most people never noticed them. Jonah did. He stood quietly, resting one gloved hand against one of the fresh support posts while watching the distant horizon. The wind carried a sharper bite than it had the day before. Ace suddenly stopped beside the unfinished frame. His ears lifted, his body became perfectly still. Then, without barking, the German shepherd fixed his amber eyes on the snow-covered mountains beyond the valley, refusing to look away, as though something hidden beyond those silent ridges had already begun its slow journey toward Black Creek. The next morning arrived wrapped in pale gray light and a cold breeze that carried the sharp scent of pine across the ridge. Jonah Price was already outside before sunrise, tightening fresh crossbeams between the cedar posts, while Ace circled the growing structure with quiet purpose. The German shepherd stopped every few minutes, lifting his nose toward the northern mountains before returning to Jonah without making a sound. A dusty pickup climbed the gravel road and rolled to a stop beside the property. A broad-shouldered rancher stepped out, folding his arms as he studied the strange frame surrounding the cabin. "Morning," he called. Jonah looked up and offered a polite nod. "Morning," the rancher chuckled. "Name is Hank Morrison. I have lived around here for 40 years, and I have never seen anyone build a second house around the first one." Jonah smiled faintly. "There is always a first time." Hank laughed louder. "You really believe this thing is worth all that work?" Jonah picked up another board and answered without looking away from his task. "Every board has a reason." Hank shook his head. "Well, I hope you find it before winter does." He climbed back into his truck, still laughing as he drove away. By lunchtime, the story had reached nearly everyone in Black Creek. Inside Miller's diner, coffee cups rested on worn wooden tables, while conversations drifted toward the same subject. "He must have brought Army engineering a little too far," one customer joked. Another laughed. "Maybe he is building the biggest woodshed in Montana." Even the waitress smiled. "Poor fellow. I guess retirement gives people strange hobbies." Their laughter filled the room. Outside, Jonah continued working in complete silence. He measured each opening with care, leaving even spaces between the outer frame and the cabin walls. He checked every angle twice before driving each nail. Ace watched every movement, occasionally brushing against Jonah's leg before wandering toward the stacked firewood near the edge of the clearing. Suddenly, the dog began scratching the frozen ground beside the woodpile. Jonah walked over. "What is it, boy?" Ace pawed harder, then looked directly at Jonah. Beneath several inches of frozen leaves lay an old drainage trench that had nearly disappeared over the years. Jonah knelt beside it and brushed away the dirt with his glove. "Well now," he murmured. That explains a few things. He followed the shallow trench with his eyes until it disappeared beneath the hillside. Instead of covering it, he quietly adjusted the placement of several support beams to leave the channel completely open. No one was there to notice except Ace. The afternoon wind grew noticeably colder. The trees along the ridge no longer swayed gently. Their branches creaked with a deeper, heavier sound that seemed to echo across the valley. Jonah stood still for a long moment, studying the distant peaks where dark clouds gathered in layers thicker than the day before. Ace slowly walked to the edge of the clearing, his ears standing straight as stone. He stared toward the mountains without blinking, then released one long, low whine that sent an unexpected chill through the silent ridge. Jonah woke before dawn to the sound of wind brushing softly against the unfinished frame. He stepped onto the porch with a steaming mug of coffee, while Ace followed close behind, scanning the dark tree line with quiet attention. The sky carried a dull silver color that usually arrived much later in the season. Jonah looked toward the mountains and spoke almost to himself. "You are moving faster than I expected." Ace answered by pressing his shoulder gently against Jonah's leg, before walking toward the growing stack of split firewood beneath the outer frame. Every piece remained perfectly dry despite the heavy frost covering the ground. Jonah smiled. "That is exactly what I wanted." As the morning passed, another truck climbed the ridge. This time it was Martha Collins, the owner of the local hardware store. She climbed out carrying a clipboard and looked around with open curiosity instead of laughter. "Jonah, I have been wondering about something." Jonah set his hammer down. "Go ahead." She pointed toward the wide gap between the cabin and the new outer wall. "Most people would close all this space. Why leave it open?" Jonah walked over and tapped one of the cedar beams. "Because trapped air is one of the best insulators you can have. The wind cannot pull heat away as easily when it has to cross two barriers instead of one." Martha nodded slowly. "So this is not really another building?" "No," Jonah replied. "It is a shield." Martha looked back at the cabin with growing respect. "That actually makes sense." Before she could say anything else, another pickup stopped at the bottom of the driveway. Hank Morrison stepped out laughing before he even reached them. "Martha, do not let him fool you. Next week he will tell you this thing keeps bears from getting lonely." Martha frowned. "He explained it pretty well." Hank waved dismissively. "I have survived 60 winters without wrapping my house in another house." Jonah simply returned to his work. Hank shook his head. "You really do not care what anybody thinks, do you?" Jonah drove another nail into place before answering. "Winter has never cared what anybody thinks either." For a moment, Hank had no reply. He shrugged, climbed back into his truck, and drove away with another laugh echoing down the road. By late afternoon, the outer frame stretched around nearly the entire cabin. Jonah carefully installed angled supports that extended above the future roofline. Ace paced beneath the structure, occasionally stopping to inspect every corner before returning to Jonah. The dog suddenly froze beside the old drainage trench they had uncovered the day before. His ears lifted sharply. Jonah walked over. "What did you hear?" Ace remained completely still. Only the wind answered. Seconds later, a cold gust swept down the mountain, much stronger than anything they had felt all week. The nearby pine trees bent together with a deep groan. Jonah slowly removed his work gloves and looked toward the horizon, where an enormous wall of dark clouds had swallowed the distant peaks. A faint crackling voice drifted from the weather radio, sitting on the porch. "National Weather Service advisory. Unseasonably strong Arctic system expected to arrive earlier than forecast. Residents should prepare for rapidly changing conditions." Jonah quietly picked up his hammer again. "Looks like we have less time than I hoped." Ace stared toward the mountains without moving. And for the first time since arriving in Black Creek, Jonah felt that even the silence was preparing for something far bigger than anyone in town expected. The following morning, the temperature had dropped nearly 20 degrees, and a thin layer of ice covered every fence post along the ridge. Jonah stepped outside before sunrise and looked over the nearly finished structure with quiet satisfaction. The outer roof frame was ready for the final layer of cedar planks. Ace walked beneath the wide overhang, his paws leaving crisp tracks across the frosted ground before stopping beside the neatly stacked firewood. Jonah reached down and rubbed the dog's neck. "One more day, partner. That is all I need." The steady rumble of an engine climbed the hill. Martha Collins pulled into the driveway carrying 2 boxes in the back of her sport utility vehicle. She climbed out smiling. "I figured you might need these." Jonah opened one box and found heavy-duty exterior screws. "You did not have to do this." Martha shrugged. "Call it an investment in curiosity. I want to see if your idea actually works." Jonah smiled. "Thank you." As they carried supplies toward the cabin, Hank Morrison appeared again with two neighbors standing beside his pickup. One of them laughed the moment he stepped out. Well, would you look at that? He found someone willing to help build the world's biggest birdhouse. Hank folded his arms. Jonah, you still have time to stop before you waste any more money. Jonah calmly lifted another beam into place. I already finished spending the money. Now I am spending the effort. The younger neighbor chuckled. You really believe this thing is going to change winter? Jonah tightened another bolt before answering. No, nothing changes winter. You prepare for it. The three men exchanged amused looks. Suit yourself, Hank said. When spring comes, we will all have a good story to laugh about. They drove away, leaving only the fading sound of laughter behind. Martha watched the truck disappear down the hill. Does that ever bother you? Jonah wiped sawdust from his gloves. People usually laugh at what they do not understand. That is easier than asking questions. Martha nodded quietly. I think they may regret that. By late afternoon, the final cedar panels covered the outer roof. A wide, protected space now surrounded the original cabin on every side, shielding the stacked firewood from snow and wind, while creating a still layer of air around the home. Jonah walked the entire perimeter one last time, checking every joint with careful attention. Nothing rattled, nothing shifted. Every support stood firm. Ace suddenly trotted toward the north side of the property and stopped beneath the tallest pine tree overlooking the valley. His ears rose high. His tail became perfectly still. Jonah followed the dog's gaze. Across the distant mountains, a dark curtain stretched from horizon to horizon, swallowing the afternoon sunlight far earlier than it should have. The wind arrived seconds later with a deep, hollow whistle that rolled across the ridge like a warning. Martha slowly turned toward the mountains, her smile fading. Jonah, she whispered, I have lived here my entire life, and I have never seen clouds move that fast. Jonah quietly picked up the weather radio resting on the porch. A sharp tone interrupted the silence before the announcer spoke, in a calm but urgent voice. Winter storm warning has been upgraded. Residents should complete all preparations immediately. Hazardous conditions are expected to begin overnight. Jonah looked at Ace. The German Shepherd had not moved. His eyes remained fixed on the approaching sky, and for the first time, the entire valley seemed to hold its breath. The storm arrived just after midnight, with a sound that rolled across the mountains like a freight train hidden inside the darkness. Jonah opened the cabin door only a few inches before the wind shoved it hard against his hand. Snow raced sideways through the air instead of falling, disappearing into the black night almost as quickly as it appeared. Ace stood beside him with his ears forward, watching the white chaos beyond the porch. Jonah quietly closed the heavy door and secured the latch. It is here, he said. Now we find out if every hour was worth it. The cabin remained surprisingly quiet. Instead of sharp drafts slipping through old cracks, the space between the original cabin and the outer shell absorbed the force of the wind. The walls barely creaked. Jonah added another log to the wood stove and glanced toward the neatly stacked firewood resting beneath the covered outer structure. Every piece remained perfectly dry. Exactly as planned, he whispered. Hours passed while the wind grew stronger. The weather radio crackled again. Emergency update. Whiteout conditions have closed all county roads. Residents are advised to remain indoors. Wind gusts may exceed 70 miles per hour. Jonah turned the volume down and looked at Ace. Looks like nobody is going anywhere today. Ace walked toward the front door and stopped. His head tilted slightly as though listening for something beyond the storm. By early morning, the electricity failed. The lights disappeared without warning, leaving only the warm glow of the wood stove filling the room. Jonah lit 2 oil lamps before checking the thermometer hanging beside the window. Despite the freezing conditions outside, the cabin remained comfortably warm. He smiled quietly. Heat stays inside, wind stays outside. That was always the idea. Meanwhile, only a few miles away, Black Creek struggled beneath the growing blizzard. Snow buried driveways within hours. Gusts forced icy air through old walls and under doors. At Hank Morrison's ranch, the furnace worked constantly, but the house continued growing colder. Hank stood beside the living room window watching snow pile nearly halfway up the porch railing. His wife wrapped another blanket around her shoulders. The wood pile is soaked, she said. Everything outside's covered. Hank frowned. I stacked it the way I always do. She looked toward him with concern. This storm is not like the others. Across town, Martha Collins stood inside her hardware store staring through frosted glass at the empty streets. Her phone had lost service, and the parking lot had vanished beneath deep snowdrifts. She remembered Jonah's calm voice. It is a shield. She whispered those words to herself before looking toward the mountains. where his cabin could no longer be seen through the blinding snow. Back on the ridge, Ace suddenly lifted his head. A faint sound reached him through the howling wind. He looked directly at Jonah, gave one sharp bark, then another. Jonah walked to the door. "You hear something, do not you?" Ace barked again, louder this time, refusing to leave the entrance. Jonah slowly unlatched the door. Through the roar of the storm came a distant, desperate pounding that seemed to echo somewhere beyond the swirling curtain of snow. Jonah pulled the heavy door open just enough to keep the wind from forcing it backward. Snow rushed through the narrow opening in a swirling cloud. Ace slipped past him onto the covered walkway between the cabin and the outer wall, barking once into the storm before stopping beside a figure, barely visible through the blowing snow. "Easy, boy," Jonah called. "Bring them in." A woman stumbled forward, holding the hand of a young girl bundled beneath an oversized winter coat. Behind them came an elderly man leaning against the porch railing for support. Their faces were pale from the cold, and snow covered every layer of clothing they wore. Jonah stepped aside immediately. "Come inside. Do not stand out there another second." The little girl looked around the warm cabin with wide eyes. "It is warm," she whispered. Her mother nodded gratefully. "Our power went out before dawn. The fireplace would not stay lit. The wind kept blowing smoke back into the house." Jonah pointed toward the chairs near the wood stove. "Sit down. Warm up first. We can talk later." Ace quietly walked around the newcomers, sniffing each of them before settling beside the child, who reached out carefully to stroke his thick fur. The German shepherd rested his head against her knee, making her smile for the first time that day. Minutes later, another knock echoed through the storm. Then another. Jonah exchanged a glance with Ace. "Looks like we are not the only safe place left." He opened the door again. This time Hank Morrison stood outside with his wife, both covered in snow from head to toe. Hank looked nothing like the confident rancher who had laughed on the ridge only days earlier. His voice was quiet. "Jonah, I hate asking this, but our furnace stopped. The wood outside is soaked solid. We cannot keep the house warm." Jonah answered without hesitation, "Get inside." Hank paused. "After everything I said," Jonah interrupted gently, "this storm does not care about old conversations." Hank lowered his eyes. "Thank you." Soon the cabin filled with quiet voices and the steady crackle of the stove. Martha Collins arrived shortly afterward, carrying a backpack filled with canned food. She looked around in surprise. "I counted 6 vehicles buried in snow on the way up here. Somehow yours was the only driveway I could still find." Jonah smiled. "The wind breaks around the outer walls, instead of piling everything against the cabin." Martha slowly looked toward the protected firewood stacked beneath the roofed shelter. Every log remained perfectly dry. "I knew it," she whispered. Hank stared through the open side of the outer structure. "All our wood is buried under ice. Yours looks like it was stacked this morning." Jonah placed another log into the stove. "The roof keeps the snow off. The airspace keeps the moisture away. Dry wood burns longer. Longer heat keeps people comfortable." Hank shook his head slowly. "All week we laughed, because we thought you were building something foolish." Jonah poured hot coffee into another mug and handed it to him. Sometimes preparation looks strange until the day it becomes necessary. Before anyone could answer, Ace suddenly sprang to his feet, his ears locked toward the front door. He released 2 sharp barks, then hurried into the covered passage outside, stopping halfway and staring into the white storm, as though someone else was still trying to reach the cabin. Ace charged into the swirling snow without hesitation, stopping every few yards to look back at Jonah before pushing farther into the white darkness. Jonah grabbed his heavy winter coat and flashlight, then turned toward the people gathered around the stove. "Nobody opens this door unless I come back. Keep the fire going. The wood is dry. It will last." Hank stepped forward immediately. "I am coming with you." Jonah shook his head. "Your wife needs you here." Hank met his eyes. "You opened your home after everything I said to you. I am not letting you walk into that storm alone." Jonah studied him for a second before giving a quiet nod. "Stay close. If you lose sight of Ace, you follow my voice." They stepped into the covered passage, and even there the wind roared beyond the outer wall like an angry river. Once they cleared the shelter, the storm struck with full force. Snow raced across the ground in waves, making every step difficult. Ace continued forward with complete confidence, his nose low, his ears alert. After nearly 100 yards, he stopped beside a half-buried fence and barked sharply. Jonah swept his flashlight across the drifting snow. A pickup truck sat tilted against a ditch, almost completely hidden beneath fresh drifts. "Over here!" Jonah shouted. He hurried toward the driver's side while Hank brushed snow away from the passenger door. A frightened voice answered from inside. "Please tell me somebody found us." Jonah smiled with relief. You are not alone anymore. Inside the truck sat an elderly couple wrapped in blankets. The engine had stopped hours earlier, and the heater was no longer running. The older man looked exhausted but managed a weak smile. We tried to make it home before the roads closed. Hank opened the passenger door. You picked the worst day in 20 years. The woman looked at Ace standing calmly beside the truck. Did that dog find us? Jonah rested one hand on Ace's back. He did exactly what he was trained to do. With careful steps, they guided the couple toward the ridge, keeping everyone together, while Ace ran ahead and back repeatedly, making certain no one drifted away from the group. By the time they reached the cabin, the elderly woman had tears in her eyes. Martha opened the door before Jonah even knocked. Warm air spilled into the covered passage. Thank goodness, she said. The rescued couple stepped inside, greeted immediately with blankets, hot coffee, and seats beside the stove. The older man looked around the cabin in disbelief. It feels warmer in here than it did before the power failed at our house. Jonah smiled quietly. The cabin is finally doing what it was built to do. Hank stood silently near the stove, watching dry firewood burn with steady flames while the storm pounded helplessly against the outer shell. He slowly turned toward Jonah. I spent days laughing at you. Jonah placed another log into the fire. That was before the storm. Hank lowered his head. I should have asked questions instead. Before Jonah could answer, Ace suddenly lifted his head again. He hurried to the front door, barking with urgent determination, then scratched at the wood with both front paws, as another faint cry carried through the wind from somewhere deeper in the valley. The cry came again, faint but unmistakable, drifting between the roaring gusts. Ace barked once and rushed into the covered passage before stopping to make sure Jonah followed. Jonah reached for his flashlight while Hank grabbed another lantern. Martha stepped toward the door. Please be careful. Jonah gave a calm nod. Keep everyone warm. We will be back. The three stepped into the storm, but this time Ace did not hesitate for even a second. He moved with complete certainty along the edge of the ridge before turning toward a narrow trail that disappeared between snow-covered pines. Hank struggled to keep pace. How can he even tell where he is going? Jonah answered without taking his eyes off the dog. He trusts his nose more than his eyes. The wind howled through the trees, yet Ace suddenly stopped beside a small storage shed, nearly buried beneath drifting snow. He scratched furiously at the frozen door and barked over and over. Jonah hurried forward and pulled against the handle. It barely moved. Hank leaned beside him. Together, the door finally swung open just enough to reveal a frightened teenage boy wrapped in an old blanket with a frightened golden retriever pressed against his side. The boy looked up with relief flooding his face. I thought nobody would find us. Jonah knelt beside him. You are safe now. Can you walk? The boy nodded weakly. My grandfather sent me to check the livestock before the roads closed. The storm came too fast. Hank recognized him immediately. You are Ethan Parker. Ethan gave a tired smile. Yes, sir. Ace gently nudged Ethan's shoulder as if urging him to stand. The golden retriever slowly rose beside him, wagging its tail the moment it saw Ace. Jonah smiled. Looks like somebody else is ready to go home. The walk back to the cabin felt shorter somehow. Ethan leaned on Hank while Ace stayed only a few feet ahead, stopping often to make sure everyone remained together. When the cabin door opened, warm light spilled across the snow. Martha gasped. Ethan! The people gathered around the stove quickly welcomed him inside, wrapping him in dry blankets while his dog curled beside Ace near the fire. Ethan accepted a steaming mug with trembling hands. Thank you, he whispered. I kept telling myself someone would come, but after a while, I stopped believing it. Jonah smiled gently. Never give up on hope during a storm. Silence settled over the room for a moment before Hank stood and faced everyone. I owe this man an apology. Every eye turned toward him. Hank took a slow breath. All week I laughed at Jonah. I called his work foolish. I told everyone he had lost his mind. Today my family is warm because of the very thing I mocked. Martha nodded. I think we all judged too quickly. Jonah looked around the crowded cabin, where neighbors shared coffee, blankets, stories, and quiet laughter despite the blizzard outside. A house is built from lumber, he said softly. A community is built when people decide to help each other. Just then the weather radio crackled once more. The announcer's voice sounded calmer than before. The storm is expected to weaken by sunrise. Emergency crews will begin assessing the county as soon as travel becomes possible. The room filled with relieved smiles, but Ace suddenly lifted his head toward the window. The wind had grown quieter, and for the first time in 2 days, a thin ribbon of pale morning light began to break through the clouds above the mountains. By sunrise, the blizzard had finally loosened its grip on Black Creek. The fierce wind had faded into a quiet breeze, and golden light slowly spread across the snow-covered valley. Jonah stepped outside with Ace at his side and looked across the ridge. The outer structure stood exactly as he had built it. The firewood remained dry beneath its shelter, and the cabin walls showed almost no trace of the storm that had buried much of the town. One by one, the neighbors gathered outside, staring at the strange construction with completely different eyes than they had only days before. Hank Morrison walked toward Jonah, carrying a small wooden plaque in his hands. He stopped a few feet away and cleared his throat. "Jonah, I have spent my whole life believing experience meant I always knew better. This week proved I was wrong." Jonah smiled gently. "Every winter teaches something new." Hank shook his head. "No, you taught us." He handed over the plaque. Carved into the smooth oak were the words, "Thank you for keeping hope warm." Jonah looked down at the gift for a long moment before quietly saying, "I will treasure this." Martha stepped forward next. "The town council is meeting this afternoon. We want to ask you to explain how you built this shelter. We think every family in Black Creek should know what you know." Jonah glanced toward the sturdy outer walls. "Knowledge only matters when it is shared." Ethan Parker smiled from beside his grandfather. "Will you teach me too?" Jonah nodded without hesitation. "I would be honored." Everyone laughed softly, and the heavy feeling left behind by the storm finally began to disappear. Just then, the county emergency vehicles reached the ridge. The sheriff climbed out and looked around in amazement. "We checked nearly every road this morning," he said. "People kept telling us the same story. They said the safest place in the county was right here." He looked toward Jonah and extended his hand. "On behalf of Black Creek, thank you." Jonah shook it firmly. "I simply prepared for winter." The sheriff smiled. "Most people prepare for themselves. You prepared for everyone." Ace quietly walked through the gathering until the little girl he had comforted the night before wrapped her arms around his neck. The German shepherd leaned gently against her, earning smiles from everyone watching. Hank laughed softly. "I think somebody deserves recognition too." The sheriff removed the service ribbon from his own winter cap and carefully fastened it to Ace's collar. "For courage, loyalty, and leading people to safety." Ace wagged his tail once before sitting proudly beside Jonah. Cameras from a nearby television station arrived later that morning. One reporter asked the question everyone wanted answered. "When people laughed at your idea, why did you keep building?" Jonah looked across the valley where neighbors were already measuring lumber beside their own homes. He smiled quietly before answering. "Because storms do not care whether people believe in preparation. They only care whether you are ready when they arrive." The reporter lowered her microphone, unable to improve upon those words. As the afternoon sun melted the first layer of snow, the sound of hammers echoed across Black Creek once again. This time nobody laughed. Families worked side by side, building stronger shelters, stacking firewood beneath covered roofs, and learning from the quiet veteran they had once misunderstood. Jonah stood on his porch with Ace sitting faithfully beside him, watching hope take shape one board at a time, and for the first time since arriving on the lonely ridge, the place no longer felt like a forgotten cabin. It felt like home. Thank you so much for watching all the way to the end. If you enjoyed this story, please like, subscribe, and share it with friends who might enjoy it too. We would love to know where you are watching from. Tell us your city and country in the comments. More heartfelt and unforgettable hero dog stories are already waiting for you. See you in the next one.